Hi, glad to see you on your channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to us. Have a good view. On the afternoon of May 30th, 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser called his Iraqi counterpart Abd al-Rahman Aref and informed him that he had signed a defensive alliance with King Hussein of Jordan. The agreement created the Eastern Front of the Joint Arab Command, headed by Egyptian Lieutenant General Abd al-Munim Riyad. In addition, Jordan was opening its territory to the movement of Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, and Saudi troops to the border with Israel. On the same day, the Iraqi armed forces went into motion. On the 31st, 10 Iraqi hunters from 6 Squadron and 2 from 29 Squadron flew to H-3 airfield in the middle of the Rocky al-Sham Desert, far on the country's western border, at the fork of the road to Amman and to Damascus and Palmyra. There, 435 kilometers from Baghdad, they were to await orders by June 5 to relocate to Jordan's Al-Mafraq, where an advance group of Iraqi Air Force flight engineers was already en route. H-3 was built in 1935 by the Iraqi Oil Company to serve as a transfer station on the Mosul-Haifa pipeline. 30 years later, the airfield hasn't changed much. One concrete paved runway, a small fuel depot, and that's it. Both pilots and aircraft technicians had to sleep in tents set up near the airplanes. The airfield did not even have camouflage nets, the effectiveness of which Indian instructors who trained Iraqi pilots kept talking about after 1965. Despite the purges among the military that followed the coup attempt in September 1965, the pilots of the Iraqi Air Force's hunters had a relatively high level of training. Many had experience in attacking ground targets during the fighting against the Kurds. It was more difficult with the senior command staff. Iraqi officers liked to play politics, and therefore some of them had to be returned to aviation directly from prison cells during the beginning of the war. The best defense is offense. On the morning of June 5th, the pilots of the hunters on H-3 were engaged in routine training flights. The beginning of the war and the Israeli airstrikes on Egyptian airfields became known somewhere around 10:03. Here and hereafter Baghdad time, when at least half of the Egyptian Air Force's combat aircraft had already been destroyed. A couple of fighter planes that were in the air were immediately grounded. All the machines were distributed in sandbags, and the pilots were assembled for a combat mission. The commander of the Eastern Front, Lieutenant General Riyad, ordered all the forces of the Jordanian, Syrian, and Iraqi air forces to immediately attack the Israeli air bases. While the Iraqis were preparing to take off, the Hel Havir managed to launch a second strike on Egyptian airfields. According to pilot reports, nearly 100 more enemy aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the Egyptian Air Force no longer posed a significant threat. Fighting was going on all along the Eastern Front. The Jordanians began shelling enemy positions in Jerusalem at 10:45, and soon the encirclement ring around the Israeli enclave on the Mount of Olives began to tighten. At 12:15 a.m., 5 hunters of Lotzi Kol Suleimani, Commander 6, took to the air, each carrying 24 3-inch rocket launchers and 2 suspended fuel tanks. The target of the Iraqi pilots was the Kfar Sirkin Air Base east of Tel Aviv. According to intelligence reports, a large number of transport planes were concentrated there, presumably for the airborne drop on Al-Arish in northern Sinai. The Iraqi unit first approached Al-Mafraq Air Base, but the Royal Jordanian Air Force planes there did not take off. As it turned out later, King Hussein and Lieutenant Riyad could not agree on a priority action, and the keys to the armory were delivered to the airbase too late, along with the commander of the Jordanian Air Force, who was in Amman. When the depot was opened, the ground staff in the turmoil mixed up the boxes, and on the first 4 vehicles were hung MSs with a training munition with inert shells. Lieutenant Col Soleimani and his wingmen circled over Al-Mafraq and, without waiting for the Jordanians, went to a low altitude and set a course for the target. Hunters lucky, half an hour before their appearance in Israeli airspace and the fighting began on the Syrian border, and 4 pairs of Mirage pulled north for air duty in the Golan Heights. At 1:21 p.m., Soleimani's 5 operated unimpeded over Kfar Sirkin, then crossed the Jordan River again, reached an altitude of 7,000 meters and departed for H3. Iraqi pilots reported that during the raid they managed to destroy or severely damage 7 transport planes of the Israeli Air Force. In fact, the enemy lost only 1 Noratlas and 1 light PA-18 Super Cub. But these were the only planes Israel lost on the ground during the entire day of June 5, 1967. The Jordanian planes, delayed but still following the Iraqis, were caught in a hornet's nest. The first link still managed to evade the Mirages, which had gotten the wrong vector to intercept, but the second link had already lost one of its machines. Further Israeli retaliation was not long in coming. At 13:45, 2 groups of planes headed for Hurghada and Al-Mansura were redirected to targets in Jordan. Subsequently, about 40 aircraft took to the air to strike the 2 Jordanian airfields. Hel HaAvir pilots managed to catch the Jordanians at a time when almost all of their planes were either returning to their air bases or refueling immediately after landing. By 4:30, the Royal Jordanian Air Force had lost 17 of its 19 available fighters. While the Blue Star of David planes were dealing with the Jordanians, another trio of Iraqi hunters appeared west of the Jordan River at about 2:20 p.m. Their target was Lod, Israel's main international airport. Despite the complete lack of enemy opposition, the Iraqi pilots were unable to reach their target due to a banal loss of orientation and disastrously outdated navigation charts. After shelling an Israeli convoy in the Jerusalem area, they flew back to H3. This incident, however, caused the Hel HaAvir command to turn its attention to the Iraqi Air Force, since all of the hunters had previously been considered Jordanian. The 4 took off, but one of the wingmen's front wheel failed to retract, and the 3 voters went to the target. The route was built from the southern end of Lake Tiberias, aka the Sea of Galilee, almost exactly to the east, to the intersection with the highway and the pipeline line, and from there to the Iraqi airfield. At this point, it was crowded on H3. Since the hunters were expected to redeploy to Al-Mafraq as early as the afternoon, Iraqi Air Force Squadron 17, 8 or 9 MiG-21FLs arrived at the airfield around 1:30 p.m. At 4 p.m., when the approach of enemy aircraft was detected, a pair of 21sts were on air duty. Another pair of hunters were preparing for takeoff. MiGs, each armed with only 2 R-3Cs, intercepted the Israelis on the approach to H3, but they, sharply maneuvering and covering each other with fire, successfully thwarted all attempts to fire missiles at them and bombed the Iraqi airfield. Immediately at the time of the enemy's attack on ground targets and immediately after it, the pilots of the 21st were still able to use their weapons, but none of the P-3Cs hit the target. The Israelis reported the destruction of 21 or 23 enemy aircraft. The command divided their optimism in 2 and considered really destroyed 10 machines, 6 MiG-21, 3 Hunter and 1 transport. In reality, the Iraqis lost 3 MiG-21s, 1 Hunter and 1 DH-104 Dove light transport. The heaviest loss was the An-12B, from which a stock of R-3C missiles and spare parts for the MiGs had not been unloaded in time. The airfield crew promptly repaired the damage to the runway, and by the beginning of the second day of the 6-day war, H-3 was ready for combat operations again. Iraqis over the Promised Land. By dawn on June 6th, 6 hunters of the Iraqi Air Force's 6th Squadron were ready for combat sorties against targets in Israel. Each of them was loaded with 8 3-inch rocket launchers rather than 24, as they had been the day before. Probably the stockpile of armament on the H-3 was running low. Eastern Front Headquarters ordered an attack on enemy artillery positions in the Jenin area on the west bank of the Jordan River and the Ramat David Air Base. There was no intelligence information about the targets. There was no contact with the Jordanian units in Jenin. The question of targeting strike vehicles from the ground was not even in principle. A trio of hunters went to Jenin. One more was forced to return to H-3 because of a failure of parts. Pilots did not find artillery positions, and about 6 a.m. worked on the mechanized column of the enemy on the highway Nazareth-Haifa. According to Iraqi Air Force intelligence, 5 killed and 8 wounded. Israeli publications do not mention the results of the raid. The first of 4 Tu-16s of the Iraqi Air Force's 10th Squadron with 6 FAB 500s for Ramat David entered Israeli airspace. At about 6:05, the crew of Major Al-Taya from an altitude of 7,600 meters bombed the airbase, but according to the Israelis, the Iraqi pilot did not reach about 20 kilometers to the target. The next 2 carcasses did not reach the target at all, returning to Al-Habaniya because of some malfunctions, and the 4th skipped past Ramat David and, making a turn over the Mediterranean Sea, dropped several bombs on the center of the city of Netanya. 22 people were killed and 22 wounded. The bomber then passed at low altitude over Ramat David, where the pilots of the 4 voters were just completing the pre-flight inspection of their machines before flying against H-3. Immediately after that, on the tail of the Tu-16 sat a pair of Mirage, trying to get close to the distance of firing from the guns, but driven away by fire from the gunners. One of the Mirages fired a Shafrir SD at the bomber. The pilot did not see the target hit, distracted by the fire switch, but a minute later the Tu-16 crashed into an Israeli army base. The entire crew perished, taking with them to the grave 14 IDF reservists at once and 2 more sappers later when they tried to defuse unexploded aerial bombs. The victory was credited to 2 Hel Havir pilots who shared it with Eitan Yariv's battery. Against the background of this heavy bomber chase, a pair of Iraqi hunters went completely unnoticed, approaching Ramat David at low altitude and carried out an unimpeded attack. However, according to Israeli reports, it was not the airbase that was hit, but 2 settlements to the north and east of it. Second airstrike. The pilots of a pair of hunters that had returned to their airfield were already landing when Hel Havir planes that had followed them to H-3, 4 voters and 2 Mirage Tweakajs covering them, were detected. 2 MiG-21FLs and 2 hunters on ground duty, in readiness number 1, were ordered to take to the air immediately. Senior Lieutenant Al-Samarai, who had already released the landing gear, managed to make a sharp turn in time and was able to thwart the attack of the Mirage that was tailing him. But Captain Uzbaki, who had started the takeoff at that moment, was much less fortunate. According to Arab sources, he took off too early, his hunter lost speed and crashed into the main water storage tank, killing the pilot. The Israelis claimed that the Mirage destroyed one of the approach vehicles. Since the 2 fighters returning from Ramat David were not shot down, it may have been Captain Uzbaki's hunter. All 3 remaining Iraqi planes managed to get into the air, and in the chaos of the dogfight over the airfield, the pilot of the second of the hunters that took off engaged in a duel with Captain Zohar's Votour was wounded, but managed to land successfully. On the tail of Zohar immediately sat down one of the MiGs, and that, in turn, in the tail was Mirage Yehuda Koren, the future double ace Hel Havir. Major Sarak, the pilot of the 21st, could not achieve target acquisition infrared guidance system missile P-3C, and the Israeli pilot was able to catch him in the crosshairs. According to Koren's report, The MiG's right wing was sheared off by a burst of 30mm shells, after which it went into a tumble and crashed. In fact, one of the shells hit the 21st in the tail section, damaged the container of the braking parachute, which immediately opened and broke off during the immediately following defensive maneuver of Major Sirach, left with a turn down. Meanwhile, all the Israeli strike aircraft were heading west at full speed. The second MiG-21 that pursued them fired 2 R-3Cs at them, none of which hit the target. At the conclusion of the second battle over H-3, Hel Havir pilots reported the destruction of 2 MiG-21s and 6 Hunters on the ground, and 1 MiG-21 and 1 Hunter in aerial combat, both credited to Yehuda Koren. In fact, the Iraqis had 1 Hunter lost and 2 aircraft damaged. The Jordanians, who included 2 Pakistani instructors, were quickly fed, assigned a truck to replace the broken-down bus, and sent on to Al-Habaniya, where they arrived around 9 p.m., having traveled another 400 kilometers or so across the desert. Third airstrike. At 3 a.m. on June 7th, the Jordanian pilots were awakened and assembled at Al-Habaniya CP. A day earlier, the future commander of the Iraqi Air Force, Colonel Hamid Shaban al-Tikriti, had personally arrived at H-3 in a spar, and, having found out the situation with fuel, water, and ammunition, made a decision to evacuate the airfield. To cover the gathering and takeoff of the remaining inline aircraft of the 6th, 17th, and 29th Squadrons were supposed to Hunters from Al-Habaniya. But there was a snag. There were almost no pilots trained for this type of aircraft at the airbase, so from the Jordanians and Iraqis had to quickly form a mixed links. At 7 a.m., the first squadron of Hunters departed for air patrols over H-3. At 10:15 a.m., the second 4 flew out to replace it. It was led by Flight Lieutenant Saif-ul-Azam, a Pakistani Air Force pilot assigned to the Jordanian Air Force as an instructor. He had already scored 3 victories: an Indian Nat, shot down on September 18-19, 1965, and 2 Israeli MD-454 Mister Eva, destroyed over Al-Mafraq on the first day of the Six-Day War. The Israelis confirmed the loss of 1, the second damaged. The Pakistani was led by 3 senior lieutenants, a Jordanian, Ihsan Shurdam, and 2 Iraqis, Samir Yusuf Zainal and Ghaleb Al-Hamid Al-Qaisi. This Air International was not far from H-3 when the commander of a column of Iraqi troops moving toward Damascus transmitted that 8 Israeli planes were coming from the west at low altitude. They were 4 Mirage 3 Kijs and 4 Voters, 2-seat in the lead, single seat in the wingman. The Hel Havir pilots had just had time to drop their bombs on the airfield runway when they were attacked from behind, overhead on a dive by a Saif-ul-Azam formation. Mirages, however, were faster. Captain Gideon Dror attacked an Iraqi pair that came in the tail of Votaram and shot down Al-Qaisi. He was immediately fired from behind by Saif-ul-Azam. The shells hit the tail of the plane, the machine stopped listening to the control, and the Israeli pilot ejected. After landing in the fuselage of Saif-ul-Azam's plane, they did indeed find a considerable piece of plating of an Israeli plane, whose pilot, Captain Yitzhak Glantz Golan, ejected and was captured on the ground together with Dror. Senior Lieutenant Zainal, who had lost his wingman, at this time continued to pursue the commander of the Voturov, who had already successfully evaded 3 of his attacks and was heading westward. The 4th attempt was successful. The shells hit the wing and fuselage of the Israeli machine, which with a tail of smoke went into a cabber, and then one of its crew ejected, but there was not enough altitude for the parachute dome to fully open. The wreckage of the Vautour and the bodies of both pilots were later found by Saudi border guards. Colonel Ezekiel Somek, who was wingman of the Vautour wing commander, ordered everyone to withdraw from the battle immediately. The Hunter pilots, however, continued their attacks and later reported that at least 2 Israeli machines flew to their deaths, leaving tails of smoke behind them. By 11:35, it was all over. Flight Lieutenant Saif ul-Azam returned to Al-Habaniya on the last drops of fuel. His wingman, Senior Lieutenant Shurdam, with his tanks almost dry, made an emergency landing on a dirt pad nearby. Senior Lieutenant Zainal, who had gotten carried away in pursuit of the enemy, landed on H3, managing to avoid being hit by the craters of Israeli bombs. His vehicle was refueled, and within an hour he was at Al-Habaniya. The Hunter pilots claimed 6 victories. Each of the 3 survivors claimed 1 Mirage and 1 Vautour. Another aircraft was credited by a battery of KC-19 100mm anti-aircraft guns, which provided air defense for H3. Israeli sources, however, confirm only the loss of 3 machines and 4 pilots, 2 dead and 2 captured. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to us. See you soon.